Hi everyone. Okay, this is part 2 of language. We're back to the language acquisition section. So here's a really nice chart, a nice summary of language development, and then I only talked about that first stage, the babbling stage, in that first video, so I'll talk about the rest of the stages in this video. So with that babbling stage, it's usually a consonant vowel kind of pair, da da na na ta ta, ma ma, and this is where some parents think, ooh, they said mama, they said da da. And you could say that babies do those sounds naturally anyway for feeding, so it's very natural that now they're turning that movement of their mouth into speech. David Myers, author of your textbook, says that before nurture molds our speech, nature enables a wide range of possible sounds. Next, we move slowly to this one-word stage. Now, in order to get this stage, the babbling changes, and actually by the time infants are about 10 months old, the babbling has changed so a trained ear can identify the language of the household. So instead of a universal kind of babbling from culture to culture, language to language, babies do start to babble in their own language. Research has shown that babies become functionally deaf to speech sounds outside of their native language. So this one-word stage is kind of a fun time, and it usually happens around a child's first birthday. It's kind of fun because one word could have a whole bunch of meanings from the baby's point of view. So if they say the word fish, they might be saying, look at the fish, or they might be saying, I want a fish. But all that they're producing is the word fish. Oftentimes their production of this sound is really barely recognizable. They might only be able to use certain sounds to produce this speech, but their parents and their family group quickly pick up a way to interpret and understand how they're speaking. In fact, family members often have to interpret for other people who aren't used to that child's speech. Now, around the time the child is 18 months old, children's word learning explodes. They have what we call literally a language explosion, and they go from learning about one word a week to one word a day. And then by about their second birthday, there's the two-word stage. So they start uttering two-word sentences. This is like telegraphic speech. So think about old-fashioned telegrams. Terms accepted, period. Send money, period. Well, children at this stage speak in this way. Want juice. Bed now. No hit. My toy. What's kind of cool about this is it still follows rules of syntax. The words are actually in sensible order. English-speaking children typically place adjectives before nouns, big doggy rather than doggy big. And then these two-word phrases progress into longer phrases. Now, some children may have gotten a later start on learning a particular language. For example, a child that received a cochlear implant, or maybe an international adoptee, but it has been shown that their language development still proceeds through the same sequence that I've talked about. Although usually, if they've got a little bit of a late start, it proceeds at a faster pace. So here is that chart again, and this is a really important one for you to get into your mind. Most importantly, I don't know if you're going to have a ton of questions asking you about the specific month, the specific age of the child, but you need to know the sequence. Because remember, this is just kind of a guideline. When you get older and you actually have children, this varies. The actual month at which it happens, it varies depending on the child. But children all generally develop in this sequence, and they develop normally by the age of 3 or 4. They are at this complete sentence stage. So the next big question that we need to ask is, how do we actually learn language anyway? And if you think about all the approaches to psychology, there's different approaches or different perspectives in explaining how we actually learn. So we'll start with the social learning theory. This comes from Skinner. Remember him from the behaviorist school. And this theory says that babies will imitate a parent. So they observe, they listen, they imitate. And if they're reinforced, then they're going to keep saying the word. If they are punished, they might stop saying the word. Here's the textbook explanation. So an alternate theory to Skinner's behaviorist approach comes from Noam Chomsky. And his theory is You could call it a nativist theory, and his theory is that we are born with this universal grammar. There's Chomsky. He argues that we learn language so quickly, it can't really be reinforced and punished. And in fact, if you think about it, think about some of the errors that children make in their speech. Some of the errors they make are not imitation, they're unique and novel errors. Another example, I guess, is Mr. Myers, the writer of the textbook, says, no parent teaches the sentence, I hate you, Daddy, yet just about every parent hears that from their children. So you could argue that it's very difficult for just imitation to play their role in language development. There's got to be something else going on. Chomsky views language development much like helping a flower to grow in its own way. So language needs nurture, but given the adequate nurturing, language will naturally occur. It really just happens. And in fact, if you look at different cultures, it's very, very interesting to compare because there are some cultures who do not speak to their children until their children begin to speak. Yet their children develop language just as normally or in the same developmental stages that we do here in the United States. Now, if you think about the United States, we parents start speaking to their children before their children are even born. Parents talk to their kids in the womb, and Americans talk to everything. Americans talk to dogs. So very different culturally, yet children develop this universal grammar and children develop language naturally. Chomsky says that we come pre-wired with a sort of a switch box. It's like a language acquisition device. And those switches need to be turned on during this critical period. So we have a critical period again with language acquisition. And if a person is in an environment that doesn't allow that switch to be turned on, then things could be very, very traumatic. So there's another slide explaining Chomsky's perspective. And then we talk about the critical period. Other pieces of evidence to support Chomsky's perspective is that no matter what the language is, we all start speaking mostly in nouns rather than in verbs and adjectives. And this is something that happens naturally. Children are not trained to do that. In fact, if you try to train your child, if you try to correct their errors, that actually hurts their development. So modeling good language is good, but error correction is bad. And another argument is that all human languages have the same grammatical building blocks. We all have nouns and verbs, subjects and objects, negations, questions, and if that is all in common, then we are ready and able to learn the grammar of whatever language we experience. So of course this is another example of maybe the nature-nurture debate. You see through nature, genes design the mechanism for a language, and experience, that's the nurture piece, modifies the brain. And looking at this diagram, also recall, especially in those first two formative years, your brain, of course, begins with the same amount of neurons that you have as you grow older, but in those first 2 years, you have the myelination of the neurons, and you have the neurons building those deeper neural networks. So at the same time, this is how your language develops. Those networks are being developed, they're being routed in the language center areas of the brain that allows this acquisition of language. Now another great question that's dealing with this acquisition of language is, what about learning a second language or learning a new language? As you get older, is it more difficult? Is there something in us when we are children that allows us to learn language better, more easily, maybe allowing us to learn more natively than as we get older? So here's a nice diagram for you to refer to. This is new language learning gets harder with age. And you see, if you look at this, young children have a readiness to learn language. It says that individuals were tested 10 years after coming to the United States. And for this particular study, this was Asian immigrants who came here to the United States. And it says there's really no sharply defined critical period for second language learning, but around, once you get past the age of 7, this ability to learn language declines. So remember, each of these groups of individuals, this is telling you when they arrived. Okay, so here we have native English speakers. These are not immigrants. Then we've got ages 3 to 7. So children who arrived here to the U.S. between the ages of 3 to 7, then 8 to 10, 11 to 15, and 17 to 39. Okay, so they arrived at that time, and then they were tested 10 years later. So you would think they were all given the same amount of time to learn English, yet clearly the younger that they arrived, the better they did, the better they were to acquire, to gain mastery of a second language. There are a couple things in particular that if you learn a second language after this age, you may never acquire. Particularly in English, it would be, and in many languages, it's dealing with articles. For example, in English, the use of the versus a versus an. Generally, somebody can be taught to learn a versus an, but how do you really know the difference between the and a? That's a very, very difficult distinction for somebody who comes from a language that doesn't even have those words or those concepts. Okay, so that's one example that many people coming to the U.S. after this age will never grasp, regardless of the schooling that they receive, the education they receive. Another is the most obvious one, and that's an accent. People who arrive later in age will always speak with an accent. So think of your own learning of a foreign language. If you go to the country that speaks that language, so for example, I speak Spanish. I traveled to Cuba when I was in college, and I speak Spanish with an accent, with this weird American accent. I don't think I will ever be able to speak Spanish without that accent, because I didn't learn Spanish until high school. Now, I've been talking about second language acquisition, but another really fascinating thing with this is, what about first language acquisition? What about children who don't receive the necessary environmental factors to nurture their first language acquisition? Are they ever able to acquire their first language? Well, the best case studies would be of deaf children and children who are natively deaf, who learn sign language after age 9. So through their childhood, maybe their parents were not deaf, their parents were hearing, and they were not taught sign. If it's after the age of 9, they never learn it as well as those who become deaf at age 9 after learning English. What that tells you is that if a person has learned English, if they've acquired their first language, then they have the abilities to acquire the other. They have that universal grammar in place. And those natively deaf children who learn sign after age 9 never learn English as well as other natively deaf children who learn sign in infancy. So when a young brain does not learn any language, its language learning capacity never fully develops. Okay, next we have this lovely question of language and psychology. Language and thinking, which comes first? It's kind of like the chicken and the egg question. Do our ideas come first and we wait for the words to name them, or are our thoughts conceived in words and therefore unthinkable without them? So we have another name here, Whorf. He's a linguist Benjamin Lee Whorf, and he came up with linguistic determinism. He suggested that language determines the way we think. So for example, he studied the Hopi people, and there is no past tense for verbs in the Hopi language. Therefore, the Hopi cannot think readily about the past. Some other examples, if you do learn 2 languages, English and another language, quite well, you might be able to notice some differences. English has a very, very rich vocabulary for self-focused emotions like anger. If you compare that to Japanese, there's way more words for interpersonal emotions like sympathy. People who are bilingual actually report that they feel like they have a different